I guest lecture at one of our local colleges each semester, teaching undergraduate students about birth control and the impact of family planning. Last fall, a student raised her hand while we were reviewing the different contraceptive methods. "Won't hormonal birth control change who I'm attracted to?" she asked. I had read about this myth online, but I had yet to encounter it in real life. She heard this on TikTok from a creator she did not know personally. I explained what the science says, that there is no evidence to suggest that hormonal birth control impacts partner choice. We moved on with the conversation, but the interaction sparked my curiosity. I wanted to know where this particular myth came from, why she believed it, and what we can do to combat dis and misinformation, a growing problem for birth control that has real impacts on access, use, and legislation. Tracing this particular piece of disinformation taught me a lot about how we can more effectively combat false information when we encounter it. So, first, let's distinguish between the two. Misinformation is false information spread without harmful intent, while disinformation is deliberately deceptive. We encounter both, and sometimes what starts as misinformation becomes disinformation. More importantly, both can be harmful, even if the intent is not malicious. So, where did this attraction myth come from? From what I can tell, the myth traces back to real, albeit limited and contested, peer reviewed research, primarily studies from the late 1990s and early 2000s exploring how hormones affect mate selection. The most cited work is around the MHC, major histocompatibility complex. This is a set of genes involved in immune function. The foundational study, commonly known as the sweaty t-shirt study, was conducted by a Swiss biologist in 1995. The basic finding was that naturally cycling women tended to prefer the scent of men whose MHC genes were different from their own, which theoretically produces offspring with stronger immune systems. Some studies suggested that women on hormonal birth control showed a reduced or reversed preference, potentially preferring MHC similar partners instead. Here's the problem. The research is far more limited and contested than the myth that has spread online suggests. Most MHC had very small sample sizes. The results have been inconsistent and difficult to replicate. A later 2014 study that sampled 365 couples found that what mattered for relationship satisfaction was not whether a woman used the pill, but whether her use was consistent from when she first met her partner. And even those findings have been contested by replication studies that found no support for that effect. Lab-based scent preferences, so in that original study, they were smelling sweaty t-shirts. That doesn't necessarily translate to real-world attraction or relationship satisfaction. The scientific consensus overall is that there's insufficient evidence to support the claim as it's commonly stated. So the science is real, but it's limited and contested, and it has no real-world implications. But the findings still spread online. Why is that? Well, science journalists and press releases oversimplified the findings, hoping to get people to engage with their content. The research was then picked up by evolutionary psychology communities online, where it was presented as settled fact. Then it spread heavily through red pill, manosphere, and anti feminist spaces as evidence that women on birth control make bad partner choices. It then crossed over into natural living and wellness communities, framed it as another reason to distrust hormonal contraception. Finally, TikTok and YouTube gave it a new life, with countless videos claiming that women woke up after stopping their birth control and realized that they were no longer attracted to their partners. So we know that this myth is not true. We know that it spread wildly online, but what makes people believe these false claims when they hear them? The first is a distrust of pharmaceutical companies or medical institutions. We're in an age of growing distrust of institutions for a variety of reasons, and people are looking to other sources for health information. I will put an important caveat here. Misinformation spreads unevenly, and communities with historical medical trauma, like forced sterilization here in America among the Black community, Those communities have legitimate reasons for distrust that aren't purely misinformation. The second reason that people believe this and these sorts of myths is real dismissed side effects that drive them to alternative sources. When a patient goes to their healthcare provider and raises a concern and they feel dismissed or unheard, they often turn to the internet to validate their experience. Once that's validated, they're less likely to turn to their provider in the future and more likely to rely on the internet for health information, which can be an unreliable source. We also live in an era of algorithm-driven feeds that support confirmation bias. So, as soon as we search for a particular idea, even if it's a false one, algorithms begin serving us more of that same content, making those fringe claims appear widespread or authoritative. This is sometimes called the filter bubble effect. The algorithm actively hides counterpoints and amplifies whatever we've already engaged with. So, the reality that we're being shown is a few sources that validate the false claim and not the weight of evidence against that false claim. And then finally, anecdotal community experiences often feel more relatable than clinical data. Clinical data from academic and scientific sources often feels more distant or unrelatable than hearing something from a real human or a friend. This is a genuine gap that health communicators need to take seriously. So we know the myth is spreading. We know it's not true. We have a sense of why people believe it. What can we do when we encounter dis or misinformation? The first thing we can do is get curious and avoid dismissing or lecturing. When we respond dismissively, we may inadvertently signal that there's something we don't want to address, leaving things murky rather than corrected. When we lecture, we risk inducing shame or judgment. Research on emotion and cognition shows that when somebody's in a heightened emotional state, their capacity to absorb and retain new information is diminished. So, information delivered in these moments simply doesn't stick. And because the person feels ashamed, they're less likely to come back to you as a trusted source in the future. The second thing we can do is ask where they got their information before correcting it. Understanding the source helps you address it effectively. If the source was a stranger on TikTok, that's different than if it's something they think they believe they experienced personally. So, for example, if someone believes that birth control caused their infertility, and by the way, there's no evidence that birth control affects fertility long term, but if they believe they experienced that and you don't approach your response with sensitivity for how personal and emotional their fertility struggle is, your response may not land at all. We can also acknowledge what's partially true before addressing the false parts. Providers, pharmaceutical companies, and health educators sometimes miss the mark here. There is an underlying fear that admitting what's partially true will undermine the key message, but the opposite is actually true. For example, it would be easy to dismiss the attraction claim as completely untrue, and essentially it is for real world effects. But if a student goes home and researches further, they'll find the MHC studies and influencers citing them as proof. At that point, you're no longer a credible source. Acknowledging the kernel of real, even if it's limited or inconsistent, research actually makes your correction more persuasive, not less. And then finally, we can provide reliable sources. After doing all of the above, after being curious, after asking where they got their information, after acknowledging what's partially true, then we can provide reliable sources to counter the dis or misinformation. If we jump straight to the science, we haven't actually addressed the false belief. We've just offered an alternative. And so the first three steps are what allow that new science to be received. That student who raised her hand wasn't gullible or uninformed. She was doing what a lot of us are doing, and that's trying to make sense of our health using the tools available to us in a broken healthcare system. The problem isn't that people are looking for answers. The problem is that misinformation has gotten very good at looking like a legitimate and trusted source. We can't fact check our way out of dis and misinformation, but we can show up differently, with curiosity instead of correction, with honesty about what the research does and does not say, and with enough humility to meet people where they are. That's how trust gets built. And trust, in the end, is what makes accurate information actually land.